Ms. Sparkle Ferreira is a cultural analyst and records and information management specialist with over 15 years experience. She holds a BA in History Special at the UWI St. Augustine Campus and a Master of Philosophy in Cultural Studies at the UWI MPhil campus. She is currently a PhD candidate in Information Studies at the University of the West Indies Mono Campus in Jamaica. Ms. Ferreira's career began in Barbados, where she worked with the West Indies Federal Archives Center, processing the personal papers of Sir Shridath Ramphal, the former Secretary General of the Commonwealth and Chancellor Emeritus of the UWI. She conducted a records and management processing project at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society as well. Since 2010, Ms. Ferreira's career focus has been in records and information management, and in her doctoral work, she is developing her expertise in digital records management and information governance. Before I give the floor to Ms. Ferreira, I'd like to introduce our second speaker also. Our second speaker will be Shridath Ramphal. Mr. Shridath Ramphal has worked as a professional records manager at the United Nations headquarters in New York for over 15 years. Before joining the UN, he worked in records and information management in Botswana. He attained his bachelor's degree in library and information science and his master's in archives and records management from the University of Botswana. He is currently pursuing doctoral studies at the University of South Africa. His presentation examines information governance in the context of access and introduces the IG approach to the information access management. For Mr. Shridath Ramphal, we have a special welcome in Setswana, and that it's Dumela Ra Re Amogela. A Setswana welcome for you, Mr. Ramphal, at our Carbicast session.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted.
Okay, let's start with Ms. Ferreira.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome. And thank you for having me. Sorry, can I please have permission to share screen? Wonderful, thank you. All right, so today I will be looking at, of course, from manual to electronic records, getting our house in order. One second, I think Murphy's Law. All right, great. So today we look at what is digital transformation. We look at just briefly some challenges and concerns that we do have as records managers, most of which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. I will look at Dirk's methodology, and I'll speak to that a little bit later as one example of how we can change or move or transition our program from a very paper system to very much an electronic system in preparation for this digital transformation agenda. And I will also briefly discuss what to consider when selecting software. All right. So what is digital transformation? Digital transformation is the integration of digital technology into all areas of business, fundamentally changing how we operate, deliver value to customers. Cultural change, an aspect of this that we really don't consider, but cultural change in terms of who we are, what we do, what we think, and just the way we conduct business. Oftentimes may challenge the status quo, experiment, and we have to, of course, get comfortable with failure. And we'll talk a little more about that when we get to the needs assessment and actually going through step by step. How do we make this transition? And of course, this came out of an online platform that spoke to digital transformation. But I also want to look at another definition, and this came out of the British Chamber of Commerce and HCL Technologies in a paper that was done, a report actually in 2022. And it says that digital transformation is important to move the business community to a digital revolution. We need to make it simple, get control of the data, and create trusted, curated resources that help firms access the knowledge they need. All right. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, it was heartwarming, to say the least, at the recent inauguration address by our current president, Her Excellency Christine Kangaloo, on the 20th of March 2023, in which she spoke of having an initiative during her term to develop the Office of the President's own recorded documented history and practices from which not only future presidents, but the entire nation can benefit. And I believe that having that passion and that drive from the head, we definitely are in a good place, because the only way that we can accomplish this is not just having those paper records as we used to, sitting in a file or drawer or cabinet somewhere in this, the infamous vault, but in transforming and making available in a timely, in a readily format, all our records, so that not just us, but as I will say later on, but our future can have access to, and our present can also find access to for research. And of course, legal will have what they need when they need it. All right. So here we have our president now coming into office and saying, listen, we have a job to do at the highest level. In Trinidad and Tobago, this is an ICT plan, and I took this excerpt from the National ICT Plan for 2018 to 2022, again, speaking to digital transformation and this move or this change, this new air that is coming out. And they're speaking in item 13 on that, advancing digital content production. And they're saying, digitization of heritage and social related content, establishing a records management system, and implementing an integrated archival management system. Again, a transformation of the country from a download one to an upload culture that celebrates ingenuity. All right. And of course, we see now the government driving this digital transformation, certainly here in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, I would not say waking us up, but maybe in a sense recognizing the importance of records management and archives, and recognizing why the need for the field, why the need for the work, why we need to maybe put this to the forefront in a way that it probably has not been done in this kind of way before. All right. In preparing this document and then, of course, driving this digital agenda, the chairman of the board of directors of IGOV-TT, he made a statement that I found quite interesting. And he said, the ICT momentum facilitates the creation of a digital ecosystem that will result in the transformation by which all citizens will be able to conduct business. And if we look at from the British definition, the online definition, to the definitions given here, we're looking at different organizations, different organisms speaking to each other and working together to provide records and information locally, possibly even regionally, and maybe even internationally, making our records that much more accessible, of course, in a safe environment, but of course, moving from this very manual, very paper environment to a more digital environment. This being said, what then is our role? And persons may look at this slide and say, what is she saying? Our role may change a bit. What we may be required to do may change a little. The record types that we are custom managing may change a little. We are now looking at more electronic records. We're looking at social media as records managers and wondering, how do we manage these records in such a, flexible or ever-changing environment? But the expectations of what we do as records managers, analysts, technicians has not changed. We are still expected to manage these records effectively and efficiently, ensuring that records are available when needed in a timely manner, in an acceptable format with minimum to no disruptions to the organizations within which we operate. I just want to briefly touch a little on the challenges of the paper system that we all most likely will know, and I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but we just look at it quickly. We have inadequate or non-existent legislation, and we know for some jurisdictions there is no records management legislation or any particular overarching guidance for managing records. A lot of time we go back to the ISO guidelines and we lean heavily on 15489, and it's almost become a Bible in that sense that we can speak it almost from the top of our heads, because that's the only document that we seem to either be comfortable with, understand, or the only document that's available to us. But then if we think about it and look at the positive slant in 2023, and as has been alluded to before, the world has changed over the last 3 years, and we're beginning to see some moves and some changes. And so although it may be non-existent today, it may not be that situation tomorrow. And as I said, in some places, that change has already started. And because changes are happening, inadequate or non-existent policies and procedures may very well be a thing of the past. Everyone in this space, has a role in developing, in writing, in contributing towards the existence now, and we are in this space to do that after today, the development of policies and procedures and managing how we move records management and information governance forward. Improper IT infrastructure for the management of records and information. Well, at this point, we should not be speaking about this, because after 3 years of working from home, I think we are all IT experts by now. Of course, we have the government operating in silos, and I keep thinking of how many times we have to done business and, we have to go to one government agency and we need a form from another government agency. And so we have to leave here, make an appointment another day, get a piece of paper to take back to somewhere else. When if we have a system, if the ecosystem is developed and developed well, we should be able to go to one office in government and conduct business because our information is in one central place. Just a thought. There is then the lack of knowledge of staff to effectively and efficiently manage records. This too, as a challenge in the past, we are making inroads. We just had the head of department of DLI speaking. We have programs within the University of the West Indies and the Caribbean now. We have international programs that are now available to us. I know that ARMA International has some programs as well, and I know that RIC as well. From time to time, you do have sessions opening up. We have conferences like these and opportunities for persons to come in and do training and come in to get awareness sessions. So we have knowledgeable staff getting into the environment. And so again, more change is happening. We know there's a lack of accountability. Persons are afraid to take responsibility for the job because, of course, if anything goes wrong, I don't want it to be on me. I don't want my name called. Nobody wants the front page exposure. And we know in the Caribbean, we've had a few of those. All right. But we're getting to a point where we have more knowledgeable staff and we have the IT infrastructure and we're getting the legislation and we have the policies and procedures. Then we have to start talking compliance. All right. We have poor infrastructure for the proper storage of records. I know this one is a struggle. But again, if we have the legislation and we're getting to that point, this is a conversation that we can now start to move forward. How do we store records? How do we safely and securely make the change? All right. And record keeping systems that exist influenced by or do not meet best practice standards. And of course, I have to admit, best practice standards first, and I'm speaking for the Caribbean now, I apologize, but for us in the Caribbean, whose best practice standards and by what standards do we need new standards? Are we using our international standards to then guide how we store the records or how we manage the records and how long we should keep the records? Or do we now need to sit and say, listen, the types of records we manage and how we manage those records and our storage or limitations, we may need to come up with our own systems. And this is one, again, that we may need to forums like these to have a conversation about, but it is a challenge. Then there's lack of financial support and resources. When for many of us, you're expecting maybe a government subvention or, government funding of some kind, or maybe you're working in an organization where you have a project funding assigned to you. You're then dependent on somebody else to provide the resources that you need. I mean, if you're a private entity or maybe a smaller company where you are responsible for your own finances, you have greater flexibility, I believe, at that point. But where you're dependent on the support and resources, that could be a challenge because, as we all know, for many organizations, the focus tends to be on the main function or the main functions within the organization. And sometimes records management is not always given the forefront or given the attention financially and certainly with resources that it needs to. So these are some of the challenges that we all know and we may have all been faced with in our careers. Because of that, you find if we don't get our house in order and if we don't improve on these challenges, embarrassment to staff and organization, those front page articles, all right, I will not go into any depth, but we know what those are. Lack of confidence, your co-workers, the organization, the public especially for government offices that are front-facing or ministries that have the public is dependent on you for a service. Is a lacking confidence in what you do. If every time we come to you and we ask for information or we have business or transactions to conduct, you're unable to provide us with the records and the information that we need in a timely manner. Low productivity. Nobody wants to work in an organization where I have to go dig amongst records or I have to go in a vault to get what I need. I prefer to sit, and oftentimes I will sit and say to you, I'm not saying I as in Sparkle, but certainly we've had the experience where persons will sit and say, I don't know where it is. I cannot find it. You'll have to come back. Processes take longer. All right. So low productivity because staff isn't motivated to work. They're not motivated under those conditions. Inadequate reporting. All right. If you can't find what you have when you need it, how you need it, it's a challenge. And I have gone on, you can go YouTube, public information, public accounts committees of parliament. I know I've seen us a few, I think Guyana, Trinidad, and you listen to some of the agencies and ministries going before the accounts committee. And a lot of times they say, well, we're unable to provide the reports or we're delayed in providing reports because our record keeping is not up to date or we don't have the staff to get the job done. All right. And oftentimes the feedback is go get your records in order and then come back. All right. We have loss of records and information. It is easy if we have not classified and organized our records to lose the information and to lose these documents. Again, because it's so paper-centric and it's so difficult to manage. High costs that can lead to loss of funding. If I have to spend all this money on storage, all this money on scanners, all this money on paper and getting it right and trying to fix this problem, I can remove your funding. You're no longer productive. Staff is motivated. Nobody is happy. The system isn't working. Then you're doing more harm than good. And why we created you as an agency or why we created you as this particular arm or, for this particular project, we don't need you. We would have to find another way to get the job done. Of course, as a result, we can lose jobs because naturally we are unable to manage the records and manage the business of the organization, and this can lead to business closures. And I do want to throw something out. In the last 3 years due to COVID-19, we had a lot of businesses closing. Now, I'm not saying that records management is the only reasons why the business closed, but if we found ourselves working remotely, an environment where sometimes we had lockdowns, we could not get to the office and our records are stored in a vault or in a file room somewhere, in a drawer, in a cabinet, and I am at home working. How do I conduct the business of the organization if I cannot access the records that I need? As a researcher, as a student, we are locked down, we're in COVID, we cannot get out. How do I access the records that I need if I'm unable to get to the institution? If everything is stored in a drawer, in a cabinet, in a file. So then how do we move from this manual system to electronic? Now I want to say, and I do want to echo some of the sentiments I heard earlier from our keynote speaker. Time is something that we don't really consider when we're doing something like this. We always think, well, we just buy a system or we go into, we do something on SharePoint and we can pull it together and maybe in about 6 months we can get, that's not how this is going to go. And for those who are purely paper and have no electronic system, you may be a few steps behind what we are doing because you need to organize your paper records first in order to get to that electronic stage. In other words, you need to know what you have before you can move it into an electronic system. You're not going to be scanning everything and try to manage it. Or we just need to improve, so let's just put everything on the system and then we'll clean it up after. That is an attitude that can lead to disaster. So before we transition, we are assuming here that everybody has their records classified. We've done a records inventory. We've gone through the process and we're now at a stage where we need to go electronic. Now, we are going to look at the Jerks methodology. It is not the only way to get things done. It is, though, I have found a very systematic, structured way, and it's easy to understand, especially for persons that may not necessarily have a project background. It is built, I found, on a project methodology, and I found it very easy to follow. So I'm utilizing this as a way in which you can transition steps you can follow, 8 steps, to move your current system from a very manual one to a very electronic model. Dirk's methodology, sorry, let me just move right. I apologize. Dirk's manual is a product developed by the National Archives of Australia in collaboration with the State Records Authority of New South Wales, and it was done in collaboration in conjunction with ISO 15489. So they would have looked at the document, and out of that, they came up with this manual, of course, of how to implement a records keeping system. Now, this methodology can be used if you're starting from scratch and you want to implement a fresh system to the organization, but you can also use it, I have found, if you're going to implement an electronic system. And in this way, this is the approach I'm taking today. The manual explains in significant amount of detail how public offices can implement the methodology in order to improve record-keeping practices. The manual, there are 8 steps outlined. It explains it, as I said, in quite a lot of detail, and it gives ways in which to improve the record keeping across all divisions or departments. And I would say if you're taking on something like this, start small, start with 1 unit, especially if you're new to it. Start with your 1 unit and apply the methodology, do your change, transform that unit, and then move across your organization. That would be one of my little tidbits that I would share with you as we go through the process. So the first step is preliminary investigation. In order to manage the records you have, you need to know what you have. You need to understand the organization. So you need to collect information in order to identify legal and structural characteristics of the organization. What's the mandate of the organization? How is the organization being governed? What's the structure of the organization? The different departments, sub-departments, heads. You then need to understand the factors influencing the organization's need to create and maintain records. Statutory and legal obligations. Is the organization governed by an act? Is there some, something in government, some requirement? Is it one of those organizations that depend on funding, project funding? What type of records or types of records that you are expected to keep and expected to manage? You then need to establish an awareness of your organization's business activities, technological infrastructure, major stakeholders, and record-keeping risks. These conversations, this information will not happen just by observation. As a records manager, as records personnel, we have to have good working relationships with the people within our organizations, within our ministries and agencies. So you are going to have a lot of meetings, a lot of needs assessments, a lot of action and on-the-ground research before you can actually get to transitioning from your manual state to electronic. It is not just about what you think you are to do, or because you are the professional in the field, I'm going to take ISO 15489 and just implement it. Each organization is different. Each organization has a different requirement. You need to understand the requirements of the organization in your preliminary investigation before you move your agenda forward. Once this is done, you can analyze the business activity. You want to identify and document your organization's business functions, activities, and transactions. And of course, when you look at this, you know fully well that you're looking at your business classification model. You need to determine how, when, and where these are performed. So at this stage, you're now starting to classify. And in essence, you're now beginning in some way, you should have already had this for those who would have done your records inventory. What happens if you already have that in place? You may just do a review. The records inventory I did 10 years ago, is that still relevant? Is the information I captured at that time still accurate? Organizations change, ministries change. And we know when the head changes, maybe a change of CEO and change of government, the functions change sometimes, classifications may change. So this is something that I know is a challenge, but this is where we get the opportunity to review that business activity again and make sure that it's up to date. Now, I do want to say at this point, which I did not mention before, these steps do not have to go directly one after the other. As you go through, you may see ways in which some may be able to do, 1 or 2 may be done simultaneously, but certainly kill 2 birds with 1 stone, if you may. Time, it takes time to do the process, but you can make things a little easier as you go along. So You do your business classification, you understand your organization. At this point, you're getting your information, you're meeting with your heads, you're meeting with your senior officers, and you are getting a better understanding of how your organization works, how the processes tune, what the transactions are, and something I like to call where your record creation points are, because we are managing records. So we need to understand what records are being created and where they sit. We then need to identify the record keeping requirements. We need to examine legal, business, and other sources to identify requirements for evidence and information. Now, again, this is not for the records manager to do solely. You cannot sit in the organization and assume you know everything. You need to sit and talk with legal. You need to sit and speak to your marketing people, your communications team. You may need to sit with your CEO or your head. You may need to go and understand and observe how things are done. If you have process flows within your organization, that might help you. It's basically a diagram showing the entire process end to end, the role that each player has, and understanding, as I said, the record creation points that are there, where the records are created, who is to have access to each record, why the record is created, to understand, or better understand rather, the record keeping requirements for your organization. Again, not at all to be developed in isolation from the rest of the organization. And I do want to add that you would also want to sit with your records management team. And this is important. This is not a one-man show. Your records team has requirements as well of their own. They may see things in a way that you may not see it. As records management, we understand, and managers, we understand that we are not the ones maybe scanning those records every day. All right, doing the quality checks. We may have our clerical team, our analysts on the ground doing that type of work. They are seeing things in a way that we are not seeing. So please, by all means, when you're building your records requirements to move your system from manual to electronic, include your team. Because as I said, they will see things that you may not always see. You are seeing high level and strategic. They are seeing things from the ground. All right. Step D, you want to assess existing systems. Why? Why do I need to know what happened with QuickBooks? Or why do I need to check with HR systems? What does that have to do with records management? But these systems receive and or create records. You need to know how they work. And it's also important, if we're moving to electronic, that we understand that these systems need to integrate with our records management systems. We do not want to implement an ERMS or EDRMS that cannot speak to these systems, because you may have more challenges, and the move fully from manual to electronic may not be as clear-cut as you think. You may give yourself and your team more work to do in the long run. There must be integration between. So you need to assess the systems, understand, we're not saying become an expert, but certainly at the ground, understand in a working way how these systems operate, how they work into the current processes, as you would have examined previously, their role in it, how the records are created, where do they come in, and how, when you start getting into considering systems, what you need to take into consideration, because those systems already exist in the organization. So you need to get a system that will be compatible and integrate well with what you already have. And if there are systems that are not meeting record keeping requirements, and they may very well be those in different units, different other agencies that are not meeting the requirements necessary, how do you then move that forward? It may not be within your remit, but you can suggest, and the system that you implement may be able to, if one system is not meeting the requirement, the records keeping system may be able to do the work and may be able to assist in that realm. So you may not need a secondary system. You may actually have all that you need and be able to take that into consideration when you are actually purchasing or acquiring a system. So it's understanding what you have and where there may be gaps, adding those into your record keeping requirements and making sure that whatever system you get is a best fit for your organization. You're going into step 5 or step E, you want to identify strategies for record keeping. Determine strategies to enable your systems to meet the requirements. What do we need to do? We can't change this out. We already recognize that finances may be a challenge, time may be a challenge, staffing may be an issue. So how do we use the systems we have to meet the requirements? You may have a system in your environment that has a record keeping module and you never considered utilizing that. How do we then use that system to our advantage? What policies or procedures, how do we get to that? What changes do we need? Choose strategies that fit with the culture and environment of your organization. Oftentimes, as records managers, we spend 10, 15 years in one organization, we leave to go somewhere else, and we take everything wholesale and try to fit it into a new environment. It may not work because the new environment we're in, it's a different industry, different culture. You're working with different persons. They have a different way of doing things. You need to sit and again, start from scratch and understand, how does this new environment work? You may be in the environment you were in for the last 15 years. And when you started, you were working with one piece of legislation and one piece of a way of doing things and one group of persons. 15, 20 years later, most of those persons would have left. You may have a younger group of persons that are more technologically savvy. And with them, they've brought a different culture and a change in the environment. How do you then move your agenda along? What strategies do you implement? Because your organization has just changed. And as we acknowledged before, because we're in an environment of digital transformation and we're seeing things changing from the governments, we're seeing legislation coming in place, privacy laws are being enacted globally and regionally. And we in Trinidad and Tobago, it's coming, it will come. We have to also be mindful of that changing legislative environment to ensure that the strategies that we implement also fit into that culture and that change. All right. Now, at this stage, we've gone through the organization, we understand the agenda, we understand the strategic deliverables, we understand the mandate that we have to do, we have gotten familiar with the processes, we have spoken and we're building a relationship internally. We now need to design our record-keeping system. What would your new electronic system look like? Do you have your policies in place? And I'll speak to that a little bit before. You've classified your organization. So you have your business classification model. You understand the processes are there. You don't want to make any big changes. You don't want to have all the processes in your organization change. But at the same time, you want to ensure that your system is a best fit for the organization and meets the requirements for all. Now, I want to stick a fin. I said meet the requirements for all. We'll never meet the requirements for everybody. All right. But at the same time, you want to come pretty close. If you've listened to your organization and if you've met with the right people and you've asked the right questions and you've gone through the process, then your design of the system, along with whoever vendor you select eventually, you will have a pretty good idea and you will hit the nail on the head as to what system to implement. At this stage is where you develop your scope of works. This is where you begin developing the documentation that would facilitate what type of system you get. Now, I am not saying at all that you are actually going ahead and writing any HTML codes or sitting and doing any SQL stuff on servers. We are not IT specialists. But certainly, you would have a picture, an idea in mind in terms of how the system will work. And that's where you begin pulling your functional requirements, you begin pulling your technical requirements along with your IT team, and you develop your scope of works that would be presented to the software developers prior to making your selection, especially for us in the Caribbean, we have our tender selection processes to follow. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. All right. We've gone through our process, we've done our scope of works, we've sent it out, we've gotten some feedback. We must do some demos. I would always suggest seeing how some of the systems work. You will never get a full idea until you implement, but get an idea of the look and feel of your electronic systems. And as you look and feel, after you've done the research, picture, does this fit into the model that we would like to have? Does this work for HR? Does this work for accounts? Does this work for the production team? Does this work for marketing? Consider your legacy data. Now, for persons who have existing systems and may need to change them out, you need to consider, how do I get my existing records, my existing electronic records into a new system? And whoever you select as your vendor, they must be able to move that legacy, the records, the data with it across to the new system. If they cannot do that, then that is not the best place for you or your organization. You need to educate staff about new systems. This is not a records management thing. Records management is everybody's responsibility. It's for everybody within your organization. So you want to educate your entire organization on the change that is happening. And I would suggest that this starts at the beginning of your project and that you implement a change management strategy as you go along. And as one of the last points, managing change. So you educate persons about what to expect, what is coming, why you're making the change, and what they can expect moving forward. And if you have a public, if you're a public interface that's going to change for the public as well, you may want to, let the public know that changes are coming. All right. You then want to roll out your technology. So we're going through the process. We've educated persons. We're working with the software vendors. We are clear on exactly what to expect. And we begin to roll out. You want to ensure that all components of the new system function according to your requirements. So you're going to check everything on your checklist. So that records functional requirements and your technical requirements. You're checking off as you go. Did I get all the reports that I need? Is the system going to manage my retention and disposal schedule? Does this manage my security and access permissions for my organization? Am I allowed to work remotely and access the records that I need? If there are any issues at this point, you address it with the vendor. And I keep going back to time. This is not something that's going to be done in 6 months. I'm going to be as realistic as I can do it. This is a process. We try not to have that scope creep if you manage your process well, and that's why I said at the beginning, it's a very much a project management type approach. If you're managing your project well, and if you have your requirements at the start, and if you've outlined and prepared yourself well, there should be very little scope creep. However, you need to be prepared and add some extra time in there for any issues that may arise. So as you check off your list, if something comes up, you have enough time to fix it. All right. And as I mentioned before, you want to manage change. Change is inevitable, but not everybody within your organization is always open to change. And not everybody in the organization, even if they're open, will change as quickly. We might have some doubting Thomases in there. So we have to cater for that. We have to cater for any change that may come. We have to speak to persons and give them enough time. We cannot go through a whole project and then when we're ready to implement, then we say, oh, by the way, we have a new system, we'll be using it from Monday. That does not work. You will not get buy-in. Persons will not use the system. You will get some challenges. All right. Post-implementation review. One does not implement a system and never follow up and check to see if it's working. You need to gather information on the effectiveness of the record-keeping system. You need to, again, do another survey or interview after, whether it's 3 months after implementation or 6 months after implementation, or you can do it 6 months after implementation and again at a year. But you want to ensure that your system is doing what it's supposed to do, and that if there are any issues, you identify it upfront so you're able to correct it moving forward. Again, all of this is part of change. All of this is part of understanding that you are providing a service to your organization, to the public. And so you want to make sure that you build confidence, and this is a way to do it. When they see you working with them and working to fix and and checking, it shows that you care. It shows that you're not just the manager behind the desk, but that you actually do understand the need, understand the concerns, and care about the end result. All right. What then do we consider in choosing a software? And please, yes, these are some that we can utilize, or some platforms that we utilize in managing records, but I'm not at any point representing any of these, nor do I wish to say that I'm a professional in them. There are 1 or 2 that I've seen work pretty well, but again, these are just some that you can do some research and figure out. You have Record Point, Laserfish. Most persons know SharePoint, of course, Microsoft 365 and Zazio. But in considering, and I spoke to some of this before, and I'm going to go through a little more, what to consider when choosing a software. Functional and technical requirements. Your functional requirements will speak to your reporting requirements. How much of your records administration do you want the system to be able, that functionality you want the system to have? Do I need a system to manage my retention schedule and disposal? Yes. Do I need a system to manage my classification, so my file plan? Yes. And so you have that checklist and any other requirements that you may have. Do I need a system to be backward compatible? Do I need a system to view PDFs, TIFFs, and JPEGs, whatever it is? Does the system be able, can the system hold image files? Can it hold videos? All right. What is the requirement? Does it sync well with Microsoft Outlook? Because I need to manage emails. My technical requirements as records managers, we may have some technical experience, but this is where you work with IT. Do our existing servers meet the requirements of this new system? Do we need to purchase new servers? Who do we need to go to? What do we need? What technical infrastructure do we need? Are our scanners compatible with new systems that we're thinking? Do we need to upgrade our scanners? Are any of the existing software in the environment up for change? So in other words, we're looking at QuickBooks 2.0, but we're going to move to QuickBooks 4.0. Is QuickBooks 4.0 compatible with any of the systems that you're considering? I always tell persons, be careful with customizations. Too much of a good thing may not be such a good thing. Sometimes we need to be careful. If we try to fix and tweak and move and adjust out of the box systems to fit our requirements, we may find ourselves in more of a challenge. Sometimes we need to allow the system to do what it was created to do and adjust ourselves to the process. In other words, records management is a custom working like this. After you implement the system, records management may need to adjust their processes, as opposed to trying to make the system fit the process that you have now. You may very well find that that may not happen. And again, you may have an issue moving from manual to electronic. You want to review, as I said before, existing hardware to ensure compatibility. I spoke about that with the technical requirements. You want to ensure that your policies regarding classification, retention, as well as access and permissions are up to date. This is something that can cause scope creep. If you do not have these functions, these processes, these policies in place, what will happen is that if you wait to develop your records classification during the project, you will delay a project. Retention schedules, those are never done in 6 months. In some places, they may take a year or two or maybe more. All right. And therefore, if you're waiting in the middle of the project to get that done, it's not going to get done. Access and permissions. You cannot implement a system and you do not know who is to have what access, when, and where. Because you can very well move records into the environment and you may find that you have confidential records now open and accessible by anybody. So these are things, and this is just a short list. Of course, we know what policies we have to have as records managers in place. We need to have these things upfront and ready before we actually get into moving from manual to electronic. I wanted to talk briefly about contract negotiations and, including service level agreements, what comes in after you've implemented your system. Because sometimes we don't think about this process. We need to work with legal. We are not lawyers. None of us here. We may have, some persons may have a little legal background. You may work in a legal environment, but you're not the subject matter expert. And we need to work with legal to understand what are we getting into. What is the arrangement with said company or the vendor that we've selected? What are the do's and don'ts? What are they promising to do? What is our role? What do we have to do? If we have an SLA with them, what is the time, the hours of operation? When can we reach them? Who is our representative? Who can we speak to? What jurisdiction are we operating within? In the event that there's litigation, are we following the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados? Or are we following the laws of New York or the UK, depending on, of course, where you're or who you're doing business with? These are some of the questions that legal will need and be able to ask and reading. And they would also check to make sure that the contract protects you and your organization, your ministry, or your agency. Again, we always hear that law is up to interpretation. And therefore, we ought not to try to interpret it ourselves. We need some guidance. And so this is where our legal team comes in to assist us. So when we're selecting a software, as we work through the processes, these are just a few of the things that we need to consider. But what else can we do? So we acknowledge we've had some challenges in the past. We've acknowledged, of course, that there are some fallouts from that. We've gone through our 8 steps, in getting from manual to electronic, those things that we need to consider. We understand now in selecting our software, some of the things that we need to think about. What else can we do to get our house in order? I spoke earlier about it, and I'm not going to delve too far into it, but again, develop industry-specific standards. Sometimes we take things that are meant for somewhere else and try to make it ours. There are pieces of legislation internationally that I do like. People might disagree with me, but I For example, I do like HIPAA to a degree, but I can't take HIPAA and implement it in Trinidad and Tobago wholesale. Again, we're looking at culture, we're looking at environment, we're looking at system and process. So how do we then take at the foundation, ISO, HIPAA, GDPR, and create standards within the Caribbean, within Africa, within Asia, to manage the records that may be unique to us, to manage records in our environment, to ensure that we're able to be effective and efficient in what we do. You want to conduct routine audits of your program. One of the definitions we looked at earlier spoke about getting comfortable with failure. When you work through the process and you do your needs assessment and you speak to persons in your organization, you may not hear all good things. You may hear a lot of negatives, but you have to have a very strong backbone. Because at the end of the day, it's the fact that you're in this position and you're making a change is because there is something that needs to improve. So as you conduct your audits, you're going to find out some things that you yourself probably did not even know. I am certain that before the end of the 3 days, we will be introduced again to the IG maturity model. And it's something that we can utilize as a guide to develop an effective audit program for organizations, because the model tells us this may be where we are, and it shows us where we want to be and what the characteristics of a perfect program may look like. Conducting that needs analysis. If we're meeting with different persons within our organization to understand what they have, what their needs are, what their processes are, you're looking then as conducting a needs assessment. And you want to check in with clients, you want to check in with your record staff, you want to check in with your customers to ensure that the existing systems are not only effective, but are still relevant. And if they aren't, what is the need or what are the needs within this space? You want to do annual reviews of your policies and procedures. And if you're doing annual policies and procedural reviews, then when you want to make this manual to electronic shift, you're not going to find yourself now updating a classification scheme or retention schedule in the middle of a project. You want to hire knowledgeable and skilled staff. We have UE graduates coming out, persons attending professional certificate courses in records management and InfoGov. All right, so this is something that you also want to consider as well. Expose record staff to training sessions. Welcome to Carbica 12. All right, and of course we have other events that are coming up, and I know DLI spoke about it. Get your staff involved. These are ways to get them into what is happening and understanding the environment that we're in. You want to conduct routine awareness sessions across your organizations and agencies. They may not be involved in records management wholly and solely, but because what they do impacts and what we do impacts them, they need to know what's happening within the department and divisions and ministries. Finally, you want to get to know the various functions, and I'm just rounding up and surmising here. We spoke about it. Know the functions within your ministry or agency intimately. All right. You want to be able to support one another. You must understand the internal operations. By understanding how others work, you can implement record keeping systems that will benefit them. I don't know your role and I don't know your functions, but if you are in a decision-making process, you want to break down silos. Why not have one policy for government ministries and then guidelines to adapt? We recently had in Trinidad and Tobago the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act being fully proclaimed. It's actually effective from today. The Office of Procurement Regulations would have issued record-keeping guidelines to help guide agencies and ministries to manage their procurement records. Something like that is a standard or a guide, or that will guide ministries, especially for persons who are not familiar with record keeping. One electronic system may be implemented. All right. But of course, with the understanding that we need to flex and adjust for the needs of each ministry and agency. Check the pulse of what is happening locally, regionally, and internationally, as we are all doing here. Use it to inform what you're doing. It can be a part of the foundation of an effective record-keeping system. Check the pulse within your organization, more importantly, to make sure that you are still familiar with what is happening. What are the needs of your organization? What are the unique standards that need to be implemented? Understand the strategic plans and changes that are going on. As I said, it is easy to implement standards set by another territorial person, but it will never truly work or be as effective in your environment because it wasn't meant for you. In other words, never seek your importance through the standards of the world. Know your worth. And finally, just keep in mind as you go along the next 3 days, the records that we create and manage today are not for ourselves, but for those who are coming after us. All right. Thank you very much for having me. This is the end of my presentation. I now hand back over to the host. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sparkle. Let's just a quick point of order. We do the question and answers after the second